Thanksgiving in the White House by Gary Hines, illustrated by Alexandra Wallner. Jack here is a fine turkey, isn't he? Said Tad Lincoln. I suppose, grumbled the White House gardener. He follows me all over the place now that I've tamed him. Watch. Tad marched right. The turkey marched right. Tad marched left. So did the turkey. He'll make a tasty dinner if you ask me, muttered the gardener, bending over to pull a weed. No, Jack's not food, Tad exclaimed. He's a pet, just like my goats and rabbits. Ow, gobbled the turkey. Ouch, hollered the gardener. I don't think he likes you very much, said Tad. Take him away, said the gardener gruffly. I've got work to do. Tad led his pet turkey around to the front of the White House. You stay here, Jack, he said. I'll be back to feed you later. Tad ran up the steps and zipped through the front door, bumping into the butler. Oh, it's you, said the butler. None of your usual mischief today, please. We're all getting ready for that new holiday your father declared. Yes, sir, Tad saluted. Tomorrow's the first Thanksgiving Day for the whole country. Everything must be perfect, said the butler as he rushed away. Tad squeezed through the line of visitors in the White House corridor. He looked them over. Most were wounded soldiers, job seekers, and widows who had lost husbands in the Civil War. For a few hours every afternoon, Tad's father, Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States, would do his best to meet with them. Tad dashed to the staircase, blocking the path of a young woman with a baby. Halt, Tad ordered in his deepest voice. 5 cents to pass. The proceeds help wounded soldiers in the Union Army. The woman burst into tears. What's wrong? Tad asked, startled. Recently I was very ill, she explained, wiping her eyes. My husband left his army post to come visit me. He went back, but they arrested him for desertion anyway. Her lips trembled. He's to be shot tomorrow. Tad winced. Oh, that's dreadful sad, ma'am. I pray the president will pardon him. Oh, he will, Tad said, his face brightening. Pa's a good man. There are so many people ahead of me, the woman said anxiously. I'm afraid I'll be too late. Suddenly, there was a commotion on the stairway above. Tad looked around and noticed one of the president's aides, his mouth tightly drawn, coming down toward him. Your father wishes to see you, the man said, immediately. Tad turned back to the woman. What's your name, ma'am? He asked. Elizabeth Miller. Tad nodded and hurried up the stairs. As he rounded a corner, he glanced over his shoulder. The hall was empty, but his father's office, the table with the visitors' calling cards, stood unguarded. Tad quickly found Miss Miller's and placed it at the top of the pile. Then he knocked on the door. Come in, said his father. Tad found the president writing busily. Hello, Tadpole. There sure are lots of folks waiting to see you, Pa. That's because this war has gone on far too long, his father muttered. So many killed and wounded. Tad nodded sadly. The president removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. Well, at least tomorrow will be a bright spot, he said, motioning for Tad to come closer. Now, what's this I hear about a toll? It's for wounded soldiers, Pa. Mr. Lincoln put a hand on Tad's shoulder. First, you tried to sell our good clothes on the White House lawn. Then you blasted a cabinet room door with your toy cannon. And now this toll. But, Pa, his father interrupted. I think it's fine that you want to raise money to help the soldiers. But charging people to meet with me is not the way. I must be available to the people during these hard times. Do you understand? Yes, Pa, Tad said, looking down. The president stroked his whiskers. Why don't you go back to running your fruit stand? That was a good idea, and our visitors appreciated it. All right, Pa. His father winked. But no more tolls. Now off you go. Tad opened the door to leave. Outside, next to his father's aide, stood Mrs. Miller. Tad smiled and went to feed his turkey. Here, Jack, he said, pulling some cracked corn out of his pocket. Pa sure does look worn sometimes, but tomorrow should do him good. We're going to have a big, delicious dinner and everything. I wish you could be there. Gobbled Jack. Ted laughed. I've got to find some apples for my fruit stand, he said. As he turned to go, he saw Mrs. Miller coming down the steps. God bless your father, she cried. He pardoned my husband. I told you he would, Tad said. She wiped away a tear. Bless you, too. You're welcome, Tad said, and headed for the kitchen. When he reached the door, he overheard the cook talking to some servants. That plump gobbler will make one glorious feast for the president. Tad crept closer to listen. One of you will have to chop off Jack's head, said the cook. Tad gasped. He turned and ran along the hallways, then tore upstairs and burst into his father's office. Tears streamed down his cheeks. The president was speaking to one of his advisors and looked around, surprised. Pa, Tad hollered. They're going to kill Jack. You can't let them do it, Pa. It would be mean and wicked. The president put down his papers. But Tad, Jack was sent here to be eaten for our holiday dinner. I thought you knew that. No, Pa, I didn't, Tad wailed. He's a good turkey, and I don't want him killed. He has just as much right to live as anybody. You pardon soldiers all the time, Pa. Can't you pardon Jack? Mr. Lincoln sighed, shook his head, and chuckled. He reached for a blank card and repeated aloud as he wrote, By order of the President of the United States, Jack the turkey is to be spared from execution. Perfect, Pa. Here, now, show this to the cook. Tad grabbed the card, gave his father a big hug, and fled. Then what am I to make for Thanksgiving? Asked the cook, studying the card Tad had just handed him. I don't know, Tad replied happily, but it won't be Jack. The next day, dressed in his best clothes, Tad sat with his mother for Thanksgiving dinner in the White House. Before we enjoy this bountiful feast of ham, hen, and vegetables, the president said, rising to speak to the guest, we should take a moment to remember all those who are helping to hold this country together, including fruit stand vendors. Tad grinned. I think it is also fitting, he continued, being our first national Thanksgiving, that I read from my proclamation, the document that created this holiday. Tad groaned and wiggled his feet. His mother touched his hand to still him. President Lincoln adjusted his glasses and began to read. I do, therefore, invite my fellow citizens in every part of the United States, and also those who are at sea and those who are sojourning in foreign lands, to set apart and observe the last Thursday of November as a day of Thanksgiving. He put down the proclamation and looked around the room. Even in times of darkness and despair, he said, there are still many things for which to give thanks. There sure are, Tad cried. The president smiled and sat down. He glanced over at Tad. Looks like we'll have a fine Thanksgiving, doesn't it, Tadpole? Yes, said Tad, and Jack will too.